Nice. I feel like you almost like we've got a plan. I don't give it away. What, that we've got a plan, or what the plan is? Now, what I realised I want to do is write the questions down. I think that's the one that I can do that now. I think I'm just a call. You guys have called? I literally just have to adjust my brow because my procedures are strong. I mean, this is not the kind of problem you expect to have.
Oh, are you all set? I see you already have your.
Yeah. It's just never happened before.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're good. I didn't put that in the list. Well,
Yeah, no, we can use the tablet, but you were having.
Got it, okay.
This new, like, I've got a new, very super secure bra, because, you know, you can't do. Yeah, last summer when we had the heat wave in England.
Yeah.
I did one evening, go to take it out and literally like put my fingers right through it, because it melted so soft. So good. Yeah.
Wait, and then did you have?
I had to call you call the breast cancer clinic and they're amazing and they'll ship on to you straight away.
Really?
I can call them anytime.
Oh, that's lovely.
This is what I wore to Robbie's graduation.
Oh, okay, I thought I'd seen it before. Okay,
It's pretty, isn't it?
it's very nice.
Very cute, Louis. Yeah, I mean, as we said, I'm not totally sure about skirts, but this length isn't.
This length is really
good. Yeah, because it covers up as I said to Sasha this morning, comes up with where did I get that bruise from?
Staggering into.
Questions here, let me know them on pad.
Lewis said he loved his question.
Really enthusiastic.
Lewis is really enthusiastic.
Maybe in that reply, it's a bit generated.
Yeah. Do you want, but I can do this part if you'd like, and then I can read a question for you. Or do you want to do?
Oh, no, so you're gonna do this.
Oh, I see, yeah.
Well, yeah, no, that would be better, because I was a bit confused about it. So why don't you ask those
Yes.
questions? And then don't ask me a question, but then I could ask them a little bit.
Yeah, you can just read
instigate them. Yeah.
Yeah, do we want it to be the three of them, or do we want it to be the two of them?
I think the three of them is great. I think it's nice to have Junior Jonathan.
Perfect. Yeah, he said we should emphasize that he's under 35,
Okay.
so that it doesn't.
You take it.
So
I think that
like
I think we should
3 or 1.
acknowledge that we have a mammal, and
Yeah.
maybe you should be the one to acknowledge it.
Yes, I will acknowledge that. And I will also acknowledge we have a Viking.
A white,
But
a
I
white
think,
man.
we can also say in our defense that we didn't know until 5 minutes before conference that we were even running the event.
And the other thing we can say in our defense is that Lewis and Bill, like,
I heard my name.
we don't have control over
I sit here.
over who has expertise in money.
Yeah.
And that actually, the white oil now is representative, and we want to find people knowledgeable about financing.
Yeah. I mean, it's could
And yes, what you
you start by the fire. Did we sit in and we've got some troublemakers in our session, right?
Luis.
Yeah, just watch out for these two. Yeah.
It looks like you're all set up here, right?
I think we're good. Yeah, I mean,
I'll be sitting right here.
oh,
wonderful, thank you. Look at that.
but also do participate as well. Just join in.
Yes. Just take this video.
Questions.
Yeah.
I'm taking some,
Yeah.
I think there are ways, if an old white guy can be taught a bit, then there are ways to.
Yeah.
Is it maybe the debrief? For the players. Hi, my
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Yeah, which one?
You're on the panel, right?
Proportion of volume that's fully been transported by road. In this category, less than 100%, but somewhere between 50 and 100.
Oh, I see.
It's going by road and somewhere between 50 and 100.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, okay. Yeah, yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
You know, I'm just.
Nothing.
Lewis is what I usually get, but I respond to all.
His knee is, well, first of all, I've changed it. That's fine. His new, well, his solution is to be on site. And there is no. No, on in soil treatment.
Please feel free to keep schmoozing. I know that saying that interrupts it, but we're gonna give a couple more minutes for the bell ringers to get people to leave
Like the
lunch.
airline, you're already more of the day than we're on, so.
Yeah.
You're already being recorded, so.
I know, that's why.
Yeah, I just.
Yeah. Maybe we jump
So
in.
I just did last session and we got the entire audience to the panel and it went.
Yeah.
It was good. It was good.
Great, and not one I would talk.
No, exactly, exactly. You were great.
Another one I we should take the left.
Yeah.
There have not been associated.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. My mother came over like.
But with the sanitation here.
And she was like, here I am. 20 years later.
Those boots are made for walking.
Chat about it.
Really? We're going to text.
I mean,
And I was.
there's
interested
the
in
night
trying
where
to
you
get
guys
what
had.
we did, but-
Yeah.
It's last night. Oh,
No.
so I said.
You know why they come to the point?
No.
So they're going to.
So you can kill the cockroaches. with
Yeah, I
that.
think you got.
Oh.
That's the whole point of having pointed shoes.
But doesn't it mean that the cockroach can hang out in the cockroach?
Well, it depends on where you think. Actually, in Texas, we would do that normally, some of these people, they take this house, they get, what do you call them? That I survived, like, the first 2 years in Texas, they got me killed by 14.
Yeah. I thought what you were gonna say.
I was born in Dallas.
People steal.
I know. you-
Yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect, so what our meetings are gonna go around, we're gonna have in case something maybe we do about Texas.
No one might even want to see one time in this league, all hat and no hat.
Oh,
It's not a competition.
I remember that. I hope it's all. I hope you said. No trousers.
All hat, you know, like the big tech. No hat, and if you look at the part, but it's gonna, yeah.
Yeah, like you say, oh, you're trying to remember what to say.
That would be.
I do. Yeah, okay.
If you're excited.
Yeah,
I know, and I know how to get the VIP thing. I'm gonna sell mine on eBay after this.
Sell it on eBay. All right, first we're gonna start with an auction for VIP stickers.
I can talk about my sponsor today.
Hello, good afternoon.
hello, Ruthie.
We are a small group and that's great. I think really just want to note that there are lots of friendly faces in the room and there's lots of expertise. And so just really want to encourage that the conversational tone that is modeled up here can continue. they will continue to talk to each other while I am talking, whether I invite them to or not. So welcome.
So the
And-
people-
I think so.
Yes, we right now we have 2 online participants,
Mhm.
and we will see if that comes in. But
Number goes up or down,
both,
whether that goes up or down.
yeah, exactly, but they're unimpressed. So, what we're gonna do for today, is we're gonna start off and, Barbara and I are gonna give a little introduction to Cactus. And then we are going to invite some panelists, to answer some questions that you might be holding, which is like, why does this matter? Why are you so into your costing tool? And then we're gonna move into some breakout groups where we will have a couple of options we'll explain to you then, and then saving the sort of building the suspense, and with some results from the database that we've been building. So do stick around. That's what we'll be sharing at the end. My name is Ruthie, and I work with Citywise, which is the advisory arm of the Sanergy Collaborative, formerly known as Sanergy. And when Barbara jumps up, I'll let her. Do you want to introduce yourself?
No, no.
Yeah, Barbara will introduce herself. So welcome to Garbage In, Garbage Out. And figure out how to advance the slides. Yeah, so whether you were intrigued by the catchy title or the witty presenters, or if you're here because you're passionate about high quality, consistent, and comparable cost data, we're very glad that you're here. And we're here because we are obsessed with cost-effective investment in urban sanitation, and because we believe we have identified the silver bullet for achieving universal access to safely managed sanitation services. Oops,
Cost effective urban sanitation change the investment fan club, right, I got it. It's a really catchy acronym.
That's right.
You know.
We need some, we really need branding assistance, that's what you're all here for.
CACTUS stands for Climate and Cost in Urban Sanitation, and it's a set of tools designed to enable meaningful comparison of the real costs of urban sanitation across different factors, including technology type, geographic location, and population size. It began as an exercise in benchmarking costs and in generating evidence-based estimates for cost, greenhouse gas emissions, and welfare effects of urban sanitation systems. We set out to do what we thought was going to be the easy part of the project, which was to collect empirical data on the costs of real sanitation systems. And as proud members of the Cost-Effective Urban Sanitation Investment Fan Club, we had a simple but elegant vision for the way that benchmarking and generating estimates would drive investment in the most impactful, cost-effective technologies and business models for delivery of safely managed sanitation services in urban areas. First, we would gather real, not modeled data on the costs incurred by actual existing sanitation service providers. Then we would figure out how to compare the costs of anything from a one-person operation with a single vacuum truck exhauster to those from a large-scale citywide sewerage network and anything in between. Easy. 3, we would identify the most cost-effective technologies and systems. And with our robust approach to normalizing and analyzing an unprecedented volume of empirical data, our findings would be credible and clear so that 4, investors would take our advice, leading to 5, widespread scaling of the most cost-effective investments. Of course, this is an exaggeration. And we thought it would be relatively straightforward.
How's that work out?
Yeah, well, we began gathering cost data and we found that the endeavor was even more complicated and challenging than we'd anticipated. And what we found, and we're going to tell you more about, is that there's a real lack of real cost data for urban sanitation. Where cost data is available, efforts to analyze and compare it are inhibited by a wide variation in technologies, inconsistencies in the classification of costs, and the rarity of actual systems encompassing the full sanitation value chain. So we found that there's no standard method for categorizing costs in urban sanitation. And what this meant for our project was that you couldn't start our analysis without first creating a system for classification of costs. And that we also had to establish distinct clusters of components and elements of sanitation systems so that we could compare across technology types and across different parts of incomplete systems. And beyond what that meant for our project, we were struck with this realization that if what we were finding is that there was no consistency in the classification and the cost data that we thought we could rely on was pretty weak, that actually sort of meant that any modeling exercise in sanitation that was using cost data was kind of using garbage as an input. And I think what I hope we can sort of get into discussion about is that we love the idea of building amazing tools that will take in just a few simple inputs and spit out the answer. And what we found was, this realization that we've all kind of been seduced perhaps by some of these sophisticated models and tools, and really didn't notice that we were all putting garbage into our amazing tools and therefore getting garbage out. So we pivoted. We sat down to develop what we found to be missing, a standard costing methodology that would enable collection of high quality data on the real costs of urban sanitation, so that all of the amazing models and predictive tools that the brilliant minds have been working on can actually stop taking in garbage, start taking in real meaningful cost data. And so here it is. This is the silver bullet. We want to end up with intentional scaling up of the most impactful and cost-effective technologies and services across the full value chain. All we need to do that is to identify the best practices. In order to identify the best practices, we need rigorous, replicable analysis of cost data from urban sanitation services, which requires meaningful comparison of actual and not modeled costs for existing sanitation services, which requires consistent, straightforward classification of costs across technologies and stages of the value chain. All you need for that is a standardized costing methodology and widespread adoption of that standardized costing methodology. And just to really get the point to land, the thing we found to be missing was consistent, straightforward classification of costs across stages of the value chain and across technology. So
We've only got one thing to say. We're not really realizing.
one more time, for the people in the back, we don't think the sanitation sector can succeed until we commit to collecting and sharing accurate, consistently categorized cost data. And Barbara's going to tell you a bit more about how we actually do that.
Okay, cool. So, sorry.
Yes, we commit to be there.
You practiced. Yeah, we really practiced. So I have to quickly introduce myself. I'm Barbara. I'm a conference addict. I find it very addictive to stand on podiums and stages. No, that's not true. Well, it is true, actually. I'm a public health engineer, but I'm also an economist in my other life, or sort of half economist. I have a degree in economics, at least. So as part of this effort, we developed a standard costing methodology. We're not going to go into huge amounts of detail. We'll try and do that in some of the breakout sessions, but essentially standard accounting methods that enable us to collect data from real systems. I just want to back up one step and emphasize the point that Ruthie mentioned a couple of times, the difference between modeled costs and actual costs. A lot of cost data that we read in the literature is future predicted cost of investment. And one of the things that's very important to understand, I come from an infrastructure engineering school, and the typical markup on an infrastructure project is anywhere between 400% and 800%. So anybody who's like predict big infrastructure, I guess David's face flinched then. So big infrastructure in the energy sector, they think nothing of 1,000% markup. They just think that's normal. We've just had a bit of a thing called High Speed 2 in the UK. Don't know if you've heard about that. The cost of that went up from 4 billion to, you remember, Darren? I think it's like at 892 billion or something at the moment. It's like stupid numbers. Anyway, the government's just cancelled that project. It's unbelievable. Well, partly because they've spent so long trying to build it. So we are collecting data from systems that have already been built and are being operated. And that's why we have to use this system of breaking up the sanitation chain into pieces, because very few people have built and are operating complete sanitation services. So we can go into the nuts and bolts of how we do it, but you don't need to, well, we're very happy to do that, but we'll do it in the working groups. We have a database, it's online, it's open access. It currently contains data on 179 sanitation components. So that's basically pieces of sanitation systems collected from a whole range of cities around the world. We're beginning to get a bit of an idea of how the cost of real sanitation systems stack up, and we'll give you the really headline data at the very end. We report capital and operational costs, and we calculate and report the total cost liability for the system as a whole. So that is the data you would need if you wanted to design a financing option that would tell you how much money you need every year to keep the system running and to service the debt. That's the important thing. So it's the amortized capex plus the opex. These data are all freely available and they're open access and they can be used by anyone. The website, however, is appalling because it's designed by a bunch of public health engineers who are not great website designers. So that's another conversation. We use TASH. I have to say, for 8 years I've been working on this. I've been calling it TAC, but my brilliant student Jonathan, who's going to talk later, presented this slide yesterday. For those of you who don't know, in the UK, this is what we call a mustache, and we call it a TASH. So I've stolen Jonathan's slide because I don't want you to forget TASH. So we've never had a standard way of reporting comparable cost data. So in the energy sector, we have certain metrics, for example, cost per kilowatt hour of energy. So you can have a conversation which says, if your system is dependent on nuclear power, you're going to need, I don't know, somebody might know those numbers, but let's say it's 30 US cents per kilowatt hour. And if you're depending on coal-fired power station, it might be 15 US cents per kilowatt hour. And everybody understands that that's a measure of the total cost of producing that energy. But we don't have that in sanitation. So we are proposing that we have TASH. That is the total annualized cost per household. We're going to use this acronym a few times. And as Jonathan said, we want you to remember it. And so I stole Jonathan's brilliant slide. The database is set up so we can normalize all the data to common years and common currencies using purchasing power parity. And we can begin to see what individual sanitation components cost to build and operate. For example, here you can see some data on containment systems, and on the left you can see, oh sorry, no, I've gone too early. On the left you can see emptying and transport systems, and on the right you can see, I'm sorry, containment systems on the left and emptying and transport systems on the right. This is just a screenshot from some moment in time when we had this data in the database, because I don't want to preempt the big story at the moment. We examine these data to better understand how to optimize emptying and transport for scale. We can also see, for example, generally that the emptying and transport systems which use manual methods are more expensive than the mechanical ones. So there's a whole bunch of kind of neat things we can start to see in this data. Once we have enough data, we could start to see how geography influences and drives costs. We could start to look at how housing density or topography could do that, but we're not able to do that at the moment. Recently, we've just been looking at some data from Zambia and seeing whether it's cheaper or more expensive than other systems in other countries. We can have conversations with policymakers about that. So here we can see, for example, this is the one of the Lusaka emptying and transport service providers. This is actually the government service provider, and they happen to have the highest cost per household of any of the providers in our database. Don't worry too much about the details because we'll look at some of the detailed results later, but I just want to show you what the database can do. We can benchmark different systems against similar systems. We can look at them across similar geographies. Once we have enough data, we can also say, oh, this is an interesting case. Why is this case more expensive or less expensive? And then you can pull down the background data that's all on the database. So in this case, we could say, oh, that's an interesting, expensive case. Let's just check if these people are actually paying their taxes where everybody else isn't. So we can start to see what's driving these cost differences. Oh, come on, system. You're going to give me a thing? Here are some full system costs. So because we use these synthetic component pieces of sanitation. We're then able to stick them together to get whole, what we call archetypal system costs. So again, these data are not the most up to date, but just to show you, for example, that we can look at the general costs of on-site systems and compare them to the general costs of sewer systems. Please don't take these results yet, because I'm going to show you some slightly cleaned up, better results later. But the important thing is that all of these systems can carry waste from collection through emptying, transport to treatment. It's a whole system cost, which is the thing we very rarely had before now. Often I find in our sector, people will say X is expensive, and you can't really tell if people are talking about CapEx or OpEx or both, or all of the system or just part of the system. I'm going to go over that. What we need now, which is something we're going to talk about in this website a little bit, in this workshop a little bit, is that we need more data. The database at the moment is really cool, and we've got some interesting results, and I'll talk to you about those results later. But really, it would be great to have a lot more data, because at the moment, what we can't do is look at these underlying cost drivers. You can sort of see tendencies in the data, but we've got lots of outliers in the data. We've got lots of very badly operated systems. We've got lots of systems operating at very low efficiency. So you can't just really look at whether it's whether it's fuel costs or staff costs that are driving the differences. We can't see any of that yet really reliably in the data. So what we have done is designed this really nice website. We've got these fantastic data collection workbooks, which were developed by our lovely colleague Lauren. Citywise led that process. You can download the workbooks, and if you're interested in then seeing how your data and your costs compare to everyone else's, you can just sign in, upload them to us, and we'll run them through the database and spit out your TASH values for your data. Just to give you a little example here, this was the data that we produced for us in Kenya. I always say that we anonymised this city, but I'm not sure. Yeah, we did anonymise this city. We didn't anonymise it. Amazingly, the managers in this city have just co-authored a paper with us highlighting what I'm about to tell you, which is pretty brave on their part. So their data is in the dashed boxes, and the Cactus general data is in the solid boxes. This is their sewer network. It's currently costing them $6,000 international per household per year. That's the cost liability of a sewer that they've just built in this town. It's pretty new. It should really be costing them kind of round about 350 to 400, but it's running at 6% connectivity. This is just a little model we made for them to show them why they're spending so much money. Also, terrifyingly, 80% of that cost liability is loan repayment. So basically, they have taken on 6,000 international dollars per household of essentially debt to provide services to 6% of 20% of their population. This is really powerful when you sit down with the mayor and you show him this. He kind of freaks out quite a lot. So that was quite an interesting. And then he says, well, surely it's the same for everyone else. And then you can compare it to him and say, mate, your number is really messing up my database because it's yanking everything upwards, which I didn't quite explain. But yeah, super interesting. So currently, in conclusion from this, cost data are very opaque. They're very uncertain out there in the real world. I contrast that with this world inside the conference world, where I would say a lot of people speak with enormous confidence about what sanitation costs. And I would say that confidence is largely misplaced, particularly in the case of urban sanitation. It makes it really difficult for even the most dedicated local decision maker to make an informed decision. It creates huge space for inefficiency and even corruption. But, and this is probably the most relevant thing to say, it also really makes space for very grandiose claims for cost efficiency. It really kind of allows you to say, here's a new piece of tech, and this is cost efficiency before we understand A, what that cost really is, and B, how it compares to other costs. Cactus allows us to be specific and clear about the total cost liability of sanitation interventions. Very easy to use tools are available online. You can download them really easily. There's really nice database manuals that help people to fill in the data. And what we're really interested in talking about today, amongst other things, is how can we encourage more people to report their data systematically and well, and could we have we got to a point where we've got something that could be useful for that, or, do you all want to invent something else? I don't care really, but I just think we need to be reporting these data in ways which are very useful. I think that's it, and it's time for the panel discussion. Cool. Do we have any questions? Any questions while I'm here? Please don't ask me about the results yet, because we're holding that up to the end, because we like to keep you all excited. Any questions on what we said so far? Yes.
Of the 179 entries that you do have, where did that come from?
Yeah, quite a mix. I once upon a time I had a slide with a map, but we probably cut it out for the interest of time, right? So we have some from China, some from South Asia, some from Sub-Saharan Africa, a few from Latin America. We don't have any US. I have a bunch of UK data actually ready to go, but I haven't put it in yet.
And it's the service providers themselves who are uploading that data?
No. So far, what happens? So here's the thing. What happens is somebody who looks like one of those people sitting there, who are my students, or a master's version of that, or even an undergraduate version of that, goes to the service provider's office after a lot of pre-preparation and drinks approximately 7,500 cups of tea over a period of about 3 weeks, while a succession of people come in and say, oh yeah, I know what that costs. Yeah, it costs, oh yeah, could you go and ask that guy who pays the wage bill, and somebody else comes in. So it's all provided by service providers. So the unit of analysis is always like the service provider, but getting it is really hard. Like I don't think ever has anybody walked into one of those meetings and said, here's our balance book. Here's all the data you need, because it's difficult. The closest we get, the CBS providers do it pretty efficiently. So we've got some data from Sanitation, super fast. Those guys know how to run their businesses. The pit emptiers can do it pretty well, pretty quick. So, the kind of service providers that Jonathan's been working with, there's always a few wrinkles, right? And sometimes it takes a bit of time to reclassify into our standard accounting model. But utilities are an absolute disaster. NGOs, an astonishing disaster. You get a lot of that. Well, our toilet costs $2, and we're like, yeah, that's marvelous. But can we please look at your account books? Because we're not interested in your toilet costs $2. We're interested in how much does it cost you to deliver this program. So yeah, that's where it comes from. But what we haven't got to yet is voluntarily people just downloading our stuff and uploading, because it's taken us a long time to get to this point, which may be because we're slow and inefficient, but also because working out how to do this, originally I thought we were going to do this all on model data, and it took me a long time talking to accountants and talking to infrastructure folk to realize that we needed this real as delivered data, not the theoretical data. Yes.
Thanks, Barbara. I was just wondering whether you could clarify something. So the costs, do they include sort of program delivery costs? Is that bundled in?
It is, yeah. So it's direct and indirect costs for the service provider running their business. Now, obviously, there's a little bit of sleight of hand you have to pull off if you have a big, if you have a national NGO that's running 7 programs, some of their programmatic costs are, you have to sit and really work out what slice of that you're going to allocate to this activity. And it's the same for utilities. One of the tricky things is that a lot of water and sanitation utilities, of course, they have indirect costs which are not really distinguishable. So you have to, that's one of the other reasons why we spend a few weeks with people trying to work out what's a realistic division of those costs. The directs are easier than the indirects for sure.
Johnny Crocker did some interesting work unbundling some of those program delivery costs off the investments. Now you get that categorization.
Yeah, well, and if we had a lot more data, we could start to say, which service providers are very efficient at delivering this. And you'll also see in my results, there's a scale effect, which is very positive at scale, but then you'll see the very big providers taking on a lot of coordination costs, which bump their indirects back up again, but they're still very efficient. So yeah, there's some interesting dynamics in all of that. There was a question here, then a question here. Yes.
Do you include depreciation? And if you do, how do you get that from people who don't consider that a cost?
Okay, so the way we deal with this is that we amortize the costs over the life cycle of every cost component. So if you have an operator who owns 5 trucks, we find out the capex for every single one of those trucks, and we work out the best estimate for its life cycle. And we assume that at the end of that period, you will have paid off the debt for purchasing the truck and you will buy a new one. And the same is true for every pipe and every whatever. So we're kind of slightly we're not including depreciation the way an accountant would. We're including essentially what I think in wash cost was always called cap man-X. Essentially, you know, it's like the next capital investment you need to make to replace the infrastructure that's broken. The reason why we did that actually is because we often think that I mean, with the exception of the big wastewater treatment plants, depreciation is not actually the easiest way to understand the cost structure. Replacement cost is easier for most operators to understand. So that's the way we do it. And that was a conscious choice to try and make it a bit more accessible. Yes. Yes, it was you.
So one question was, how easy do you think it would be for people to enter data themselves, given that, you know, you have people spending 3 weeks with several individuals just trying to make sense of the question and where to find the data? And then maybe related to that, what do you think would be the incentives for people to be plugging in that data?
That is a really great question. So I don't think it's easy. I think it should be easy, but I find it amazing how few of the operators relatively that we've spoken to, I mean, can, with some honorable exceptions,
What I would add is just that the 3 weeks was before we, in many cases, before we created
before we have the nice data collection.
the Excel spreadsheets and the manuals to accompany it. We started that process hoping that it would be like, anyone can do it. And I think ultimately the complexity of them and the fact that they consider really specific cases makes it so that it's probably not at the point, and it probably won't anytime soon be at the point that sort of like anyone can pull this offline and enter it, but that we've the process of design.
Sometimes people can. I mean, I think it depends. I mean, I would say that the people that are running really good businesses can do it quite easily. The people who are running very sort of financially opaque businesses find it harder, is probably the case. I'm going to come back to your incentive questions. I thought, Jonathan, did you also want to come in on
I
that?
was going to answer the question, because I've had the experience of using the tool and using it to analyze data. When the data when the data is already well organized, it's really straightforward. There's plenty numbers into the tool. It's the art of collecting the data.
Yeah, I mean, just to give you an example, I mean, literally, at the early days, you know, there was one case we were working with a pit emptying business. So not, you know, and one of the questions is, what's your wage bill? But it's you know, you would think somebody could answer that question, right? But then it's actually, well, actually, of course, we don't pay wages monthly, we pay wages when there's money. So then you're kind of like passing through, well, we're going to have to actually look at the day book and, you know, pull out all the receipts for all of the payments being made to all of the staff. So it's a bit mixed. The incentive structure is something we would love to talk to everyone about. I mean, for me, the incentive would be that we get to a point where no donor and no government, well, no donor will fund a service provider and no government will license a service provider who can't report their cost data reliably. And I think that's something that we should be calling on. You know, that's something like, I don't think the incentive will necessarily ever come from unless people are really interested in the benchmarking question. So we do find the emptying associations. I mean, Jonathan's had loads of interesting work with emptiers in East Africa who kind of do want to know what their cost structures look like and how they look like compared to other people's cost structures. So a bit of mixed on the incentives, and again, would really appreciate a bit of a conversation about that in the room. I'll take one here and then one here, and then we could.
Yeah, so have you said you didn't have any data from the US. I assume utilities are part of the citywide financial audit, like municipal financial audit.
Yeah.
Have you tried to work from a financial audit of a big utility and see whether you could extract the?
That's a great question. No, we haven't, but we could. Yeah, that's a really great question. No, we haven't. Yeah, that would be a great PhD. Right, Jonathan, who are we going to get on that? I'm not saying Jonathan's on it, he's nearly finished.
I think British, you wouldn't be able to do that. It would be so opaque.
Yes, it's true.
I don't think it'd be like it.
Yeah, it's true.
Better here because for the regulatory, they have to report.
Yeah.
I was actually gonna ask a similar question, but my version of it was, can US or UK utilities actually report all this information?
Well, it's so interesting, isn't it? I mean, UK water utilities are supposed to be reporting it to their shareholders. So yes, you would think they could, right? Whether they do or not, and whether me as a non-shareholder can get it is an interesting question. But I mean, that's kind of one of the next steps, is to look at who else, you know, how far can we incorporate different operating models into our framework. Cool. We now have a very lovely, illustrious panel. I'm really sorry to say it's a manel. Even worse than that, it's a whitey manel.
I'll just leave.
No. Please can I invite my very illustrious whitey manel colleagues up here? We were trying to think, why did this happen? Part of it was that we had to put this side event together quite at the last minute because we didn't get a side event to start with. But also we were reflecting on the fact that we wanted to talk to these three guys because they're all people who had reason to think long and hard about the cost of sanitation because they finance stuff and they control financing decisions, or in Jonathan's case, they research financing decisions. And maybe it's no coincidence that the people who are most knowledgeable on that subject at the moment are old white guys.
Pardon?
Well, I'm saying
I'm
you're under 35, but you're aspiring to be an old white guy.
Yeah, I'm trying my best.
I never want myself knowledgeable on a subject, those are your words.
Do I get it there?
Yeah, I think so.
Cool.
Then it's not a.
No, now I'm making it not a man
Mark, you asked it, I just wanted to add to Mark's question a bit about whether UK utilities can answer this question. And I'm going to give Barbara.
Is there an online, the only reason, if there's online folks, we should probably use the mic.
Yes, you should
otherwise
speak into
they
the
will
microphone.
not-
There are a few online participants, so that would be
How many?
great.
2?
Well, it's
We're
also,
up to 5.
but it's also,
Five.
but
Oh,
but
yeah.
it's also being recorded, so you need to be.
Yeah, so that
So
would be
Jonathan,
great.
speak into the microphone. You can take it off its stand.
Yeah.
Great. So,
Do you want to sit here?
yeah,
you
sure.
He was, really, he was comment.
What?
He was commenting.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, Jonathan's just making a comment.
Please,
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, shall I
Yes,
finish it?
sorry.
So to answer, Mark asked, can utilities in the UK answer this question, or do they report TASH? And from my experience, I would say no. But that's because they don't need to. They're regulated to report other kinds of costs and not this one, so they don't end up thinking about it. And this is the bump for Barbara. That was one of the reasons why I wanted to do the PhD, because I saw this tool and I thought it was driving me nuts working for the utility, but we didn't know the answer to this. And I couldn't compare the TASH between a big wastewater treatment plant and a small.
So what you're telling me is if I've never started this, I wouldn't have to put up with you.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
Exactly.
cool. I'm glad you came.
I'm gonna stay up here,
Yeah.
and I don't have to take the microphone from you guys.
Yeah.
So again, we are a relatively small and informal group, and so I think that I'm gonna kick us off with some questions, and also encourage banter and discussion among the panelists, as well as, questions. I think what we potentially would eat into the time of is really that we wanted to kind of spend some time going to the website, opening up the tools. And I think that if we have a lot to discuss, we can spend less time opening up our computers to look at the tools. I do think that it is extremely worthwhile to download one of the Excel worksheets and one of the manuals and just to see. Because ultimately, we didn't create the tools right away. We spent 3 weeks in many different places figuring out what was difficult to get and building manuals out that address the likely pieces of bits of confusion. Anyway, just in case we don't get to that.
That's a good point.
So we'll start with you, Jonathan.
Oh, yeah.
As discussed, you've worked in sanitation in the
Yeah.
UK and in Kenya. And now you're studying infrastructure economics. And so as a service provider and as a researcher, what does actual cost data enable that modeled cost data cannot?
Okay, thank you. So I was thinking about this morning, and I realized that I had 3 pieces of experience I could draw on to answer the question. The first is that I used to work in the UK water industry, where I had the opportunity to work with a cost model that was very similar to this, that estimated the cost of individual components of wastewater treatment, and that was really helpful. But then I worked, since then I've worked recently with small sanitation startups who don't have this kind of cost data and they can't do cost estimating, so I felt that frustration. And then thirdly, I've been working as a researcher where I have used Cactus. So there are three things that I think this is really useful for. The first is reliability, and Barbara mentioned that earlier, that cost estimating based on, it's called analytical cost estimating, isn't it? Yeah, where you build the cost estimate up using individual components is really, really unreliable. And there's amazing research that's already been done on that demonstrates it. So this kind of cost estimating increases reliability, and I'll mention why I think that's useful at the end. The second thing is that if you're using it, it's so much faster than building your own cost estimate. And that's brilliant because you're always under loads of pressure to answer questions, and particularly in dynamic environments where people are asking you to change why you're doing the cost estimate or how you're doing the cost estimate. Having this kind of database would speed it up a lot. So why is this important? I think this kind of cost estimating builds trust with investment decision makers. And so that's both when you're comparing different types of sanitation system, when you know you're making a sanitation investment, but also if you want to compare investing in sanitation with other basic urban services, it's really useful. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Follow-up questions or comments from others on the panel?
Ask them their questions first.
Yes,
and then
that's perfect.
Yeah.
I just thought they might want to.
No, they're looking quite like.
Stop the mic. Lewis, I'll give you the next question.
Oh, okay.
So for those who don't know Lewis, short summary of his background as a background for this question. Started in finance and economics, was a champion for thinking about the full sanitation value chain. You know that graphic, that's this guy. So if you think of
The original drawing was yours.
No, I just commissioned it. I'm graphically challenged. If it was my drawing, it never would have gone anywhere.
And then now in your current work, you're really advocating for taking a systems change approach. And I think from all three of those perspectives, you're really well placed to answer the question of how uncertainty about the cost of sanitation services limits our progress toward increased access to sanitation. So what's it costing us not to know the cost?
Okay, I will give three answers to that also.
And Lewis, whenever you're ready, I can pull up here.
Yeah, I'll tell you. That's the third.
Got it.
So the first relates to some of the work I've done both as a funder and as a board member of innovative sanitation approaches. So when I left the Gates Foundation in 2013, Sanergy actually snagged me pretty much around then to become a board member. And I was board member until a couple of years ago. And so if you are involved in an innovative organization, which in the case of Sanergy knows exactly what their costs are. One of the things you want to do is be able to convince the powers that be, municipal authorities and others, that you've got a better mousetrap. And one way to do that is with your cost data and say, hey, it's cheaper to do this. Well, the only problem is there's no other data. No, they don't know what it costs them to deliver that service. So you're sitting there saying, hey, we've got a better mousetrap. And it's very hard for Sanergy. For the longest time, they were comparing it to Dakar, which is Sanergy's in Nairobi, because that was the only place there was any data of any sort. And I didn't even know how good that data was. And Barbara would probably tell me it was crap. So it really matters if you want to develop, and we need a lot of innovation in this sector. It really matters to know what you're being compared against. The second is a finance person of old, and one who's gotten really grumpy with the wash sector. I'm here to tell you that finance is only about two things: risk and return. That is the essence of finance. If anybody tells you it's a lot more complicated than that, they don't really know what they're talking about. Risk matters because if you're putting money into something, you want to have an idea of how likely it is you can get your money back. If you don't know what the costs are of something that you're investing in, it's really hard to know whether there's going to be anything left over to pay you. So it's really useful from a financing point of view, and people would like to get more than grant financing into this area to understand what the costs are. The final reason is one that all I can say is it's the boss question. One day your boss asks you an awkward question. And so by way of illustration,
I know, it's not, it's
Overall.
how do I opened it as you said, but it is not.
I need to check. We're waiting with Vicky.
me too. Visual helps. I can do it without the visual, but.
No, there'll be, there's at least 3 PhDs or plus.
Yep,
That's not necessary.
they went to school much more recently than I did. I had to give a.
Good thing I'm not up there.
Just trying to.
Oh.
There we go. Okay, see if we can make that the full screen. Sorry,
Yeah,
this
there
is
it
a PDF. So, some years back. How many years back? Almost 20 years ago, I was in Pune in India, taking the head of the foundation I worked for at that point, which was Bill Gates, around and showing him some community toilets, which were really cool because they stayed clean and they had somebody who lived, a family that lived there, and there was a community center at the top, and they were working really well. And I also showed him a public toilet. And he asked me the question, but the public toilet's so much cheaper, why isn't it better? And I was not immediately able to answer the question until I thought about it a bit. I'm a little slow on the uptake. And then, second slide, there are only 2 slides. I came up with there we go. I came up with the metric of not capital cost, which is what he was asking me about, but something I call the life cycle cost for actual use, which is not so far off from what you're doing.
Yeah.
And now I had some actual data for this, not as much as she would like, but I had some actual data. So we looked at the capital cost. We looked at the operating and periodic investment costs, the monthly cost per seat, as they refer to it in a large public toilet. Where we had some data, we actually had data from the community toilets, didn't have any data from the public toilets. But one of the things we knew about the public toilets is the reason they look like they do in the first picture is nobody maintained them. Utility costs, expected life, 5 years, which was really generous to the public toilets. Because in fact, once they get gross and disgusting, nobody really wants to use them. So that was more like 6 months or something would be the actual, but we decided to be a little generous there. And then we looked at the actual usage, and that we had to estimate, but we had some base to do that. Anyway, from saying that the public toilets are cheaper by almost half on capital costs, we came down to life cycle costs per actual use, which was the community toilets were about a quarter or a fifth the cost of the actual of the public toilets if you use the right metric. So my hat is off to Barbara and her colleagues for using a somewhat similar metric. And that's the third reason is that your boss is going to ask you about it.
Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. And Jan Willem. So for those who don't know, Jan Willem has supported dozens of service providers, researchers, policymakers, and regulators, among others, and played a critical role in making Citywise something that we all know what it means. And so I think thinking about experience in the sector and what you've seen come and go, wondering if you can kind of tell us, why does the cost of sanitation matter when we think about scaling up citywide inclusive sanitation specifically?
But you already answered that question. So the discerning audience will notice that I'm the only one in this August company without a finance degree or any finance experience. I am merely a public health engineer that worked primarily on the delivery of rural sanitation at scale. And yes, I've worked on Citywise, but not so much from a costing perspective. And why I say you already answered that question is in the early slides in the presentation, very clearly having a framework for costing, which we don't have, and having a method to then come up with a set of figures that allows you to compare costs between service delivery models and technology choices, making the best choice and investing is like the best pathway to scale I can think of when I think of service delivery. And when you don't have that, that's the situation I was in when I was working, I think, for the same foundation you were working
As it happens.
most recently, as it happens. What can happen, and actually did happen, is that you back into using methods that are extremely unhelpful. As Louis already sort of demonstrated. So what we ended up doing, giving ourselves the task to say, we want to figure out what are the best models that will work at scale in delivering rural sanitation, was coming up with what we thought was, a good number. We would get a budget, say from UNICEF, we would divide it by the number of people served, according to the proposal. And if that number came above $15 per person, well, that's not an acceptable proposal. That is an approach that was really based on nothing, right? Like it was based on some understanding we had of service providers that work at large scale, particularly in Bangladesh. So it's not as if we completely pulled it out of the air, but as an approach to budgeting and decision making, it's actually very difficult to defend. So thank you. But I have two questions to the collection of PhDs in this room, which is
Not me.
plus you are.
None of us have PhDs.
Not me.
So, question one is 13 years ago, the foundation actually made a rather large investment in another organization that developed the wash cost approach, which allowed us all to talk and understand the concept of life cycle costing, CapEx, CapManX, all that stuff. We have that, so why do we need another one? That's the most important question. 33 years ago, when I was at Leeds University myself, we were actually taught about something that is remarkably similar to the total cost per household for wastewater treatment plants, waste sterilization plants, and maybe even rural options, but I'm vague on that. And what happened? And why again?
Why again? Cool. May I? Please. Yeah, no, so is this working? So the wash cost question comes up a lot. So wash cost did a really important job, which was to get people in the wash sector to think about life cycle costing. So to think about whole life costing, that was really important. It's based on quite a small number of, so the actual data that's available on the wash cost platform is for not a very large number of systems. So it doesn't kind of cover the full rubric. So one of the things we first looked at was using the same framework for this work, because what we thought was the problem was that it hadn't been used to look at what I would say are sort of large networked systems, or even really to think about road-based systems as network systems. So it can tell you, it tells you quite a lot about components of the system. It's not very good at telling you what the whole sanitation cost could be, but it wouldn't have been very difficult to just build up the database so you could do more of that. But the other thing is, we talked to a lot of service providers, and we talked to quite a lot of policymakers, and we talked to a lot of infrastructure people, and we had infrastructure people on our team. So we had engineering project management colleagues working with us on this. And everybody said to us, why don't you just use standard infrastructure accounting? Because everybody understands that. And we said, yeah, good point. And so that's why we did what we did, because the problem with wash costs, and I kind of understand why it happened. I think wash costs did a really important job, which was to get people thinking about the life cycle cost liabilities, but it's not a very useful or kind of policy facing way of doing it. What we find with these data is it's relatively easy in the countries where we've worked so far to take the data as we've collected it and show people how it relates to the standard audit book that they might have to fill in, or the whatever. You can take, if we did this for a UK water utility, you can stick it straight into the AMP framework, and it just matches, because these are standard infrastructure accounting categories. If you say to an infrastructure accountant, we're using CapManX, they literally think you've grown a pair of horns on your head. They're like, what is that? It's just not. And I don't know why that happened, really. It's a funny thing, because I think we should have really been facing towards the infrastructure accounting. But I have to say that I thought at the beginning that we would use the same framework. So it did take us a long time to wake up to that. The 33 years ago question is a great question. And I think I agree with you. I mean, I went to the same university as Leander and was taught by the same professor. I now do that guy's job. So we were taught, because we were in an engineering school, we were taught how to do infrastructure accountancy and how to look at the economic costs of infrastructure investments. And again, it's all about bringing that, which is standard practice, into the wash sector. But without, so I agree with you. I don't think this really isn't very innovative, except that I think the most innovative thing we've done is we worked out how to build out cost estimates for complete systems which don't exist. That was probably the most innovative thing we did. But the actual accounting approach is very standard. And I mean, I think it's logical for all of us to think about, you know, basically you're looking for your total cost liability. Like, how much money do I need to run this system and recover the capex that I needed to put into it? I mean, incidentally, you can also look at these costs. You can, if you've got a capex grant and you don't want to include it in your accounting, you can hoik it out. You know, that's not difficult at all. But yeah, so that's some of the reasons. So it's not in any way meant as a sort of contrast to wash costs. I see it as a progression. I really do see it as a progression, because I feel like we have got the wash sector now to think about life cycle costing. So now, next step was to get them to think about infrastructure cost estimating. I think. Do you agree? I need to check with my boss.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can open it up to questions and keep the discussion going. Any questions for our?
I mean, if they're really looking droopy, we could tell them the answers as well. I don't mind doing
the result. Yeah.
But let's,
I'm gonna raise a question, which comes up frequently if you're in the business of supporting innovative sanitation models, which often do not have the enormous capex of the traditional sewer-based models, which is, that's the only thing the government wants to pay for, is the capex. Or that's the only thing that the name your country development agency wants to pay for. And there seems to be this assumption that if you pay for the capex, the rest will work itself out. Which, as anybody, I mean, that doesn't usually work out that way. So I am a huge fan. In fact, I sort of work with Sanergy for years to get them to focus on the cost per person per year, the full cost, the life cycle cost per person per year. But trying to have a discussion with somebody who's very oriented towards capex about that is really hard. So how we bridge that gap and how we get other folks to start thinking this way. Those who have ideas, please pipe up.
Yeah, definitely.
I actually have a comment.
Do you want to?
Yeah.
We seem to have only one mic.
We do have one.
Yeah. So I was just gonna make a brief comment, which is that it's interesting to hear this conversation, and I think the same thing is happening in rural water right now. So, you know, there's a PhD candidate here at UNC who's collecting the life cycles, maintenance costs for hand pumps, and finding that they're way higher than anybody thought, way higher. And that there are all kinds of hidden costs that are not being accounted for. So I think there's some interesting parallels, and this is all about shining a light on some of the assumptions that we've made in the sector for years.
Can I respond to
But
that?
there's
Let's take a couple questions.
Okay,
and then-
fine. That means I have to write it down. So.
So I was just thinking about the target audiences for this talk. Because I mean, we are sitting here and we're all working in the sector, so it's a bit of an echo chamber, like, oh, great, this would be useful for us, but just wondering how amongst countries, amongst governments, who do you see as the main people who want to be taking up the tool? And if there is someone kind of showing interest for the.
Great question.
And not to skip to whatever the results are, but I really enjoyed the presentation, or like the part where you were saying you showed that mayor, if they increase the connections, that this would be a whole different story. So I started thinking about cost drivers and electricity. There is often subsidized depending on the context, and how do you consider that? And then also, how easy is it to compare things like electricity or the cost of finance in these different contexts, and then use it to compare across countries?
You wanted to.
Sure. Clarissa, Osprey also supports and has for some time something called uptime, which there have been multiple sessions on here. And one of the reasons we support it is they've got really good cost data. And it's only on the basis of that data that they can do what they do, which is provide a supplemental payment per person per month based on a couple of criteria, one of which is the autonomous uptime, which is you've got to have the water flowing at least 29 out of 30 days a month. So I think there's it is the right discussion to be happening. We have other folks here like Water for Good that work in very challenging environments and yet have developed a way of keeping things running in that, in large part because they really focus on supply chain and getting trucks going out and keeping things running. So it's nice that I do find it interesting that we're having similar discussions in rural water and in urban sanitation, but I think there's a lot, for those who aren't familiar with the uptime learning, I strongly recommend going and reading their working papers. They've just come out with a new one on water safety, but the ones before it, which go back 3 or 4 years, are terrific.
Yeah. No, I can endorse that. They're great. They're also really well written.
I know, it's probably because of the British education. Sorry.
On the audience question, that's great. So at a city level, and I think Jonathan might have some thoughts on this as well, but at a city level like this, the example I showed you, I mean, that was a pretty amazing experience. We had a very good researcher working on that, and he'd worked in that city before. He used to work for JICA, and then he went back. So he had a good relationship with the city, and he really put in the hours and he ended up with, like, you know, the engineers and the line engineers, like not the professional engineers, but the engineering supervisors who walk up and down trying to look for the sewer leaks and so on, and the mayor in the room. And it was good, you know, because we had some real stories to tell, and we were able to, you know, one of the things is when we first said 6,000 per household, everyone's like, yeah, sewer's really expensive, aren't they? And we're like, no, that's not the conclusion. Yeah, I mean, 6,000, I mean, but you can, you know, in that particular case, sewers, in fact, were not that expensive, but they were hugely expensive the way they were being run. I mean, for you know, I'm not saying I made the right original decision, but having made the investment decision, you might as well optimize the cost liability, right?
Which then points to another great discussion we had yesterday, I think, a great point for why you want this cost data, because only by looking at it and by then saying, yeah, it's because nobody connects, which is a story that is repeated the world over, project after project after project, and somehow doesn't get us to change our view of the world or our view of how development financing should work. And the connection cost is still not included with the cost of the loan. So we're still asking households to pay. Hey, they don't pay. Hey, we have an underperforming treatment plant and a non-working sewer. Like, so if you're saying here, we're developing a framework that should help us and that should change the way we do things. And we understand that actually changing the way we do things is hard. We heard it yesterday in the plenary, we heard it today in the plenary, we see it all around us. You're gonna make this happen. Like, what's the actual pathway other than the widget that says now we have a better tool?
Yeah.
I'm just gonna add to that one thought, which is, and I don't do a huge amount of urban sanitation, but I'm an enormous fan of the ship flow diagram. Because I think the ship flow diagram is a wonderful way to get a politician's attention to the fact that the city is full of shit. And that the vast majority of the waste in the city is not being treated. That's very hard to ignore. But then the next question is, what do I do? And I think if you're gonna answer the question of what do I do about this, you've got to be able to have some numbers in order to say, this is what you need to do. Here are your options, here are your alternatives, and this is what it's going to cost you to do it.
Yeah. So just super quick, carrying on that, and we're coming to your point, but the other thing about audiences, I just wanted to say that we've had quite a lot of, we spent a lot of time in Zambia. We did a whole load of training with Zambian utilities working in coordination with GIZ. And that was interesting. So the regulator's quite interested in trying to get all of his operators to report using standard consistent forms because he wants to benchmark them, right? So that was quite interesting. So we haven't got there yet, but that's the process which is ongoing. I think you might have something to say about users, right?
Do you want to?
Who uses the data?
Yeah, I was just going to very quickly add, what do I think the target audience is?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm answering for Barbara, but for me, like safely managed sanitation, it's a public service and the target audience is city authorities. And that's why they went for TASH, because that's the language that city authorities speak, like kilowatt per hour.
Yeah.
And before we jump into the last question, Barbara, I think one thing I just want to sort of call out and differentiate is that we are not trying to say that this costing methodology will solve all of the problems. And I think the idea that there's sort of there's a bit of an echo chamber, but within this echo chamber, we're using rules of thumb that are wildly inaccurate. And so if all that happens is that it draws attention to the real costs in the echo chamber, solid progress. And then in terms of kind of other audiences, I think we recognize that this is potentially not going to, they're not necessarily going to find utilities that like, I'd really love to reclassify my accounts. I'd really love to invest tons of time in changing the categorization for them. But regulators, funders, those who are dispersing the money or those who are responsible for making sure that we get what we're paying for can drive some of that. We're sort of realize that part of the reason it takes 3 weeks and 7,000 cups of tea is we've even gotten our way in. It's like that's an accomplishment, and then we need to make it as easy as possible for the people with the data to give it to us. And so sort of just noting that like that's part of the problem, and that what we're saying here is that there are so many pieces. There's decision making, there's policy, there's the challenge of figuring out what to invest in, and one piece of that is just getting more clear data on what the costs are, but not to in any way suggest that it's the only thing. And then why don't you respond, and then we'll take one more question?
Yeah, so I just had one. Yeah, I had one other. Oh my goodness, now I've completely blanked what I was going to say. Oh yeah, no, I was just going to say. I think of what I was going to say. Oh my goodness, I'm in old lady mode. I was going to say, just to re-enjoy. So this idea of total annualized cost per household. We wrote a paper about how we were going to do this, and we thought so hard about what's the unit of analysis, and per household is what we chose because most local authorities are financed through property tax. And so if you talk, I mean, you can also pull out all this data on a per capita basis as well. The system can spit it out that way. But if you speak to a mayor, if you know what people are generally paying in property tax, and you can compare the cost of delivering the sewage or the CBS or whatever it is that you're delivering, or the whole sanitation system for the whole city, that's a kind of nice comparable number. So yeah, the mayor was quite an important part of it. I can't remember what your question was. I'm coming to you, Mr.
That's about electricity.
Oh yes, comparing across countries. So we use international dollars converted using purchasing power parity. So it's not perfect. I would say I haven't quite got the pitch of where you would end up with this, like the global database. If it was, like IBNet, or if it was at scale, you would not be wanting to use it for domestic decision making in that Kenyan town. I think you'd then kind of put the data back into Kenya shillings and have a look at the real cost. But it gives us a feel for how those costs compare over time across the different cases. So I would say you would use it for different purposes. You would worry a bit more about that if you were really using it to choose between two different systems in a city. Yeah.
I'm going to give a last comment to Jonathan and then exercise my power as moderator.
Yeah. Is this the last thing to say?
For now, before we move into the results, make it count. Just kidding, no pressure.
So because I've used the pro forma, the list is exhaustive. It thinks of all of the costs that service providers could hide or not include or whatever. And that just allows you to go through the process of thinking what might have been missing, what might I not have included. And that's really nice.
Yeah. And also later on, it gets you a chance to see, I mean, we could pull out all the people that have given us data and tell you who's not paying tax. I mean, we don't, because that seems like a risky thing to do. But if they're not paying tax, then the tax ain't showing up. That's a fact.
So exercising my power. Thank you so much to the panel, and thank you for the participation. I'm just going to grab this microphone. So the reason I'm exercising what little power I have as moderator is to make sure that Barbara has time to go through the results. And just to flag two things. One is we would love to hear from you, and I really want to encourage just like 5 minutes on cactuscosting.com, download one manual, one workbook, and just get a sense of it. Because I think really the second thing that's innovative about what we've done is that we've made it much easier to input the data accurately. And
Okay.
And then the other thing is that we have a poster, we're poster number 27 in today's poster reception. And so actually, we really would love to continue to hear from you. If you've got some time to stop by and keep the discussion going.
Cool, yeah, thank you, thank you. Yeah, so for those of you that aren't going to come and hang around with me and read the poster reception, it's quite a narrow space, right? So all of us wouldn't fit in, so maybe it's not a bad thing. Oh no, we're not going to do that. So some results. So we have a paper coming out. I was really hoping I was going to be able to say, here's the paper, but I'm still waiting for the galley from the journal. But we have a paper with basically all our latest results set out. And so, yeah, hopefully you'll be able to look at that in the next day or two. So this is the headline news. So this is a very simplified, I can show you the sort of longer version of this, but essentially these are what we call archetypal systems, which are in our database. So you can see, it's got a pointy thing. Yeah, we have a pointy thing. Oh, look, it even has a, yeah, look. So here we have our container-based systems. At the moment, the container-based systems that we do have are shared sanitation. So we do know that some of the container-based, I'm struggling with this, some of the container-based systems will pull this little squidgy thing up a little bit. So for household, we think it's hitting around 400, 450, and for shared about 250. I think that's what we're thinking. So just to let you know that. Here we have infiltrating pits. These are all of these here are with mechanical emptying and no transfer stations. We can have them, we've got costs for systems that use transfer stations, costs that don't use transfer stations. So we have infiltrating pits with mechanical emptying and transport, tanks with infiltrating structures and mechanical emptying and transport, sealed tanks which are emptied, so all of the contents of the tank are going in the truck to the treatment, and then we have combined sewers and separate sewers. We've got, I'll show you a much more detailed version of this, which you can look at the end, but basically just to remind that these systems here are handling the black water, this system here is handling black and grey water, and these over here, well, this one here is handling also stormwater. Headline news, everything all the median costs are hovering somewhere between about 450 to 550 per household for household service. There's some variation, you can see there's some big variation. And if we had a lot more data, we'd really be able to say what's driving this variation. The one thing we can say for sure is that a lot of this variation, particularly up at the top here, is driven by low connection rates for sewers and low saturation for road-based systems. So inefficient road-based systems, that's what's driving it. You can drag all of these down without investing in any more concrete infrastructure, just by connecting people or running your system more intensively. So that's very surprising. I think it's pretty surprising. I mean, my paper up here, my choice of the title of our paper is what I'm trying to say was maybe there's no such thing as low-cost urban sanitation, but there's no such thing as high-cost urban sanitation. It's urban sanitation. It's all kind of falling somewhere in the same ballpark, and in certain circumstances, some things will be more efficient than others, and in other circumstances, other things will be more efficient. But it's not possible to say that one thing is consistently an order of magnitude more expensive in total cost liability than anything else. And I don't think that's something that the water sector says very often. And that's why I think I'm happy to also talk about it in the echo chamber. And, you know, you will go to sessions here. The other thing I just want to say about this is my little, which is what I now remember in my old lady moment of forgetfulness, I was going to say. A lot of people ask us, well, do you include what the household pays for the emptying service? So I want to tell you something very important. These costs do not include any payments which are made between one step of the sanitation value chain and the next. So this is the total amount of money that is needed to run the system. It tells us nothing about where you should get that money from. And that's another thing that I think is a real problem in the wash sector, is that a lot of technologies are associated as if it was ordained by God himself or herself, that a certain technology is associated with a certain financial structuring decision. And I don't think that's true. And I think that's another reason why looking at the total cost envelope is really helpful. Because the question we have to answer is if our particular system, suppose we're using this system here in our particular city, no, let's take this one just for a moment because it's the Seward one, it's interesting. It's cost, we need about just over 550 international dollars per household per year to run that system and service the debt. That's not to say that all of that should be paid for by the city, and it's not to say that all of it should be paid for by the household. And similarly, at this end, I think there's always an assumption that all of this must be covered by the users. Why? These are comparable services. They're all providing a full service chain. So I just want to say that one of the other things we're really interested in doing, Ruthie and I, is disconnecting cost from financing decisions. I think that's super important. Okay, sorry, I will belabor that point a little bit. Also interesting, we get lots of, Musa, who's sitting here, was another PhD student of mine, did a really great paper a few years ago looking in Soweto. We know that if you have increasing housing density or increasing connection density or increasing scale, then the cost of sewerage fall on a per household basis. That's a very well-known thing. These results are quite interesting. These are for emptying and transport service providers. So this is total annualized cost per household just for the emptying and transport component, just for a moment. So this is TASH for the emptying and transport plotted against numbers of households served. And we get this sort of beginnings of well, it's clearly an inverse relationship. It looks like a curve. We haven't got quite enough data to be really sure what that curve looks like. I just want to point out that over here at very high scales, there's a load more data points that are off the end of this chart, which I didn't want to put on just so you could read it more easily. Up here we have Nairobi Freshlight, and it looks expensive, right? But here we have a provider who has internalized all of the coordination costs and is also paying all their taxes and providing all of their workers with health insurance and PPE and all of those other things. So I think there's an interesting question about scale, but also what this tells us is something about the marginal additional costs if you want to actually have a really well coordinated, saturated service. So I don't want to suggest that this is an inefficient service over here. So what do we think overall? We think that sanitation services with household toilets median costs are between 450 to 550 per household per year to deliver total cost liabilities or life cycle costs. I would argue that there's no evidence that any mode of delivery is inherently better value than any other or much cheaper. But in different circumstances, things will be better value than other things. I would also say that our data confirms something that I think we all know, that you can argue to the nth degree about your technical choices and whether you want a 4-inch pipe or a 5-inch pipe or a bi-weekly collection or an 8-day collection or whatever you are. But I mean, fundamentally, if you're not actually operating your system very well or connecting your people to sewers, can we stop having those esoteric conversations and just kind of make sure the management is good? Management turns out to be one of the most cost-effective things we could invest in, I would argue. And who said about the operations and maintenance? I mean, it's operations and maintenance, right? The other thing to say is in the efficient service delivery system, so not the Kenya example that I gave, but where systems are running sort of at capacity and are reasonably well managed, then out of the life cycle costs, typically 80% of those costs are OPEX. So OPEX is what matters. I think that was all. Oh yeah, and I just left, this is the much bigger version of that simple table that I showed you at the beginning. All the details of this are on the poster, but I will also, if anybody would like to see the paper, you can email me or Ruthie and we can share. Oh yeah, yes, yeah, there's another side and there's our email. And that's it. Yes, man. Oh, I'm trying to see you behind Musa. Deepa, you probably need the microphone because of the online people.
Yes, everybody knows. Come on up.
Yeah, but yeah.
You know. No, this is, okay, Barbara, I had the luxury of a brief, so thank you. And I'm so stoked. I think there are so many possibilities from this analysis. What caught my attention as I was listening to it again is you seem to have a fairly high fixed cost that's non-responsive to scale, which means it's not just fixed versus variable. I would assume all businesses that have some sort of a transport dependency have a large variable cost component, but your business model, so for example, a call center that will pay for irrespective of how many households you serve. I'm curious, can you tell me a little more about what those fixed cost components are in your business model and why you've chosen to internalize it particularly wanting to become competitive, in the market. I'd love to hear more.
Sure. Any other questions?
Yeah, should we take a few questions? Oh, Musa, yeah, do you want to just give the mic to Musa?
There we go. Show me that in charge.
Thank you so much. I get a chance to ask my professor question. But the question I want to bring in is about the synergy kind of container-based sanitation, which was quite one of the ways that such things come down is looking at the benefits that come with the network side, which I think the resource recovery that comes from that could actually help to reduce the total annual cost from that. I don't know if you had a chance to think about that, or I don't know if you're going to think about that in your future research.
Can I just clarify something? I think this is really important. Sanity's transport and emptying costs are high. Sanity's overall costs
Quite low.
are low. So that's only the emptying and transport costs, but if you build in the containment, the emptying and transport and the treatment, they're very competitive. So I always forget to point that out. It's just an interesting effect of the emptying and transport thing, yeah. But still, it's a good question, because we could all bring down the cost, right?
Yeah. So what Louis, why don't you keep that mic as our chiller in chief? See if there's anything you want to add. But honestly, I mean, Louis has been interrogating our finances for years, and it's helpful. It drives, and so happy to have you comment. I think what I would say is the main, or like what's most useful to say is it's not that it was intentional. It's more that like we have to do the full value chain. We can't rely on someone else to safely manage some other part of the value chain.
No, sorry, it's satisfying. So this, you look at the only other business model that I'm familiar with from a data perspective is soil.
Yeah.
So where you see, so you're fixed and variable. So as you
Right.
go on scale, you see the fixed that you have. So you actually see an exponential shift. But in your case, you're seeing a lumpy fixed cost that's not responsive to scale. If you're going from, let's say, 1,000 to 10,000, your cost is still pretty high on emptying and transport. And it's not moving in a inverse direction as you would usually expect.
So I guess what conceptually, what I will say is that the majority of our costs are on emptying and transport. And that there are tiny options, like we focus on identifying tiny opportunities to cut costs, but I think in terms of the data.
Yeah, I think so. That graph is for all the service providers in our database.
Okay.
It's not for Fresh Life. So just go by, where is it? It's this one. Yeah, Fresh Life, it's higher for that high scale, but that's not just, it's because their fixed costs are higher anyway, because they pay their staff well, they pay their taxes, they pay health insurance. So, but anyway, I mean, we can get into the weeds. Sorry, I didn't explain that super well. Sorry, that's, yeah. And I was going to say something, oh no, yeah, resource recovery, yeah, of course. I mean, and just to also say, we deliberately in this project stopped at treatment, assuming that, you know, that treatment, I mean, we're only interested in treatment systems that are kind of working. Obviously, you can offset a bunch of these costs by making and selling product, by doing a bunch of other things, but we didn't want to get into that because honestly, again, in my experience in the sanitation sector, this bit in the middle about what stuff costs is the thing that everybody slides over. It's like, oh, let's go to recycling. Oh, let's go to financing. Oh, let's go to a smart subsidy. Oh, let's go to a new bit of tech. Whereas we just decided to do the kind of dull bit in the middle. But I think you can take that dull bit in the middle and then append to it. How would you recover that cost from reuse and
Or
so
from
on?
users.
Or
Or
from
from
users.
users.
Or from public financing that's well structured.
And I think as someone who, we do reuse the waste, we generate revenue from reuse. And I think the biggest thing I have to clarify is reuse will not make you profitable. And that really comes down to, I think, like confusion around what it costs. Because if you think it costs $15 per person, and you hear that you can make, I don't know, $1 from the waste that comes from a person, you think that that's gonna, but the comparison is so off, and we can offset costs with reuse. But I think what we are fighting against is the perception that like truly had a utility reach out and say, we heard that we can reuse our waste, And we think that we can use that to cover the deficit for water service delivery.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, no, please, no, you can definitely not make a profit on your waste treatment because of reuse. And I think that's where, again, just shifting back to like, you can make a little money. But if you really think about how much the total cost is, you won't be so quick to
Yeah.
focus on the reuse train.
But it also took you a while to figure it out, because
Yes.
the original assumption was that you.
Yes,
Yeah.
we are in some ways responsible for the perception we fight against now, yes.
Yeah.
So this graph,
Yeah.
have you used the same cost of capital for both of the technologies, and if so, what is it?
Yes, we have. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I can look
The
at.
discount rate?
We use standard discount. Jonathan can probably answer this. Go for it, Jonathan.
5%.
5. We could-
That's a real rate?
Inflation adjusted 5% real rate of,
Inflation adjusted 5% real rate.
that's what I'm asking.
Yes, yeah, that's right. I mean, and we can modify our cost model. I would love more people to look at our cost model. I really would. That would be great. I mean, we've published it already once, and you know, and it's on the website. We're very transparent about how we do it, but yeah, we can really think about that. I also, sorry, yeah, no, go ahead, Del.
No, well, that just raises the question. Did you think also about doing the economic cost as opposed to financial cost? I mean, what you've got is something in the middle, right? If you're using a 5% real, that's not the financial rate nor the social rate.
No, that's true. And one of the problems is that it's pretty difficult to work out where all this capital is coming from. We were struggling with that a little bit. I think if we had a load more data, we could actually put real costs of capital in for these models, but we didn't really feel like we had enough data to do anything useful with that at this stage. We didn't do full economic evaluation. I would be very happy for someone to do it, but again, I think that the financial analysis is so rarely published that we really wanted to just get, and I think for.
Yeah, I agree with that, but you know, if somebody's gonna look at this and they're gonna make a decision based on the financial cost and not the economic cost. If
Yes, they
they're
are.
not careful, they're gonna try to, and you do that in the presentation, like, look, they're all about the same, but financial costs are about the same. We don't know what the economic costs are.
Well, but you're delivering the same kind of service.
Well, the inputs are gonna be different. You shadow price the inputs.
Yeah.
The inputs are gonna be very different across from the sewers to the.
If you shadow price them, yeah, but I would argue the mayor wants to know how much money they need.
That's fine. I mean, then. but-
It's not, I agree with you that we should do the economic analysis as well, but I mean, I am really interested in utility service providers and mayors making financial decisions.
But I mean,
Yeah.
I think it's a bit of a risk to look at this and say the costs are, well, you could say the financial costs are about the same.
We do.
If the capital costs are the same.
Yeah.
Barbara, let's clarify, you're not proposing this as a specific decision-making tool in a particular city
No,
for somebody to decide
Never.
what sort of sanitation to use.
never,
They might take the methodology here
correct.
and use that in order to get the real, it won't be actual data,
Yeah.
but try to get good projected data
Yeah.
from different types and
Correct.
use that to be able to compare apples to apples.
Correct.
But I don't think anybody would want to use this as the basis for deciding
No.
in a particular part of a particular city
No.
what the right type
No, no,
of sanitation is.
What you said earlier about this, we have to dehyphenate financial strategies from service delivery models. And I think what this does not account for is interest. It doesn't account for like what you're gonna pay, how it's gonna get financed, and the structure of financing. So this is an economic model.
Well,
Is it?
No.
Is it that?
In the financial part.
No, it's a financial model.
But with
So-
very specific assumptions.
Yeah, but with a set of specific assumptions about the cost of capital. We are amortizing the cost of capital over the life cycle of the investment. Yeah. Also, I just want to say, on behalf of all, I'm not a non-economist, but on behalf of all non-economists, people don't understand. I mean, it's a good point you've made, Del, and it will remind me to be very much clearer in my presentation, because people don't understand the difference between economic costing, financial costing. I mean, I would say this is cash accounting, really. We're just saying, how much cash do you need to run this system? That's,
And that is very important.
that's the level we're working at.
It's a good start, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
exactly.
think if I can share one closing thought as we get to, the end. First of all, thank you all so much for joining. And I think what I would, my request of all of you, is that where you have critiques and you have questions, like bring them in a productive way. That ultimately what we're trying to do here is, I think we've done a pretty good job of doing the specific thing we set out to do. And it is not that that solves all of the problems,
Yeah.
but that if we can address this and build on it, then that's a really powerful next step to take. And just to really encourage you to go to cactuscostume.com and take a look at the tools and come to our poster session. And thank you all so much. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you, Ruth.
And thank you.
Well done, guys. I got a 3 o'clock.
Thank you. Oh, right next to you.